All right, 49ers. So much anger and hate in church. Chiefs. Oh, that silence was painful. It's Taylor, isn't it? It's Taylor that's done this. So just some food for thought as you think about the big game tonight. Taylor Swift and her Swifties have generated more cheers for Swift than there was for the entire Chiefs team. Just wanted you guys to know that. Have generated $331 million for the Chiefs in the NFL this year. I know, haters going to hate. Feel whatever you want to feel. Do whatever you want to do. And just listen to this. Kelsey's jersey skyrocketed by 400% within days of Taylor attending her first game. So I'm just going to let that sit right there while I say, along with my friend Chris Collins, go Panthers. All right? So that's it. So title package asked, if you saw that, what were the words that in your house growing up were off limits? Like, what were the things that you weren't supposed to say? Last week, if you were here, I started by saying, hey, I want you to talk about the greatest, like the biggest, most public scandal that you can think of. So I want you to turn and talk to your neighbor about this, and then I didn't actually do that. But I thought today I should actually do it. Say, turn to your neighbor and just say all the words that you weren't allowed to say growing up. And then I thought, that's a terrible idea. I like my job, and so I'm not going to do that. But you had words, right? There were words that your parent, and it's funny because some of them, weren't even curse words, but they were just a thing for your parents. And then there were, certain things in the South that were different than in the North and in the East and West. So it's all these different things. And we certainly had those in our household growing up. But what I remember more than the words was we had these house rules. And I distinctly remember that some of those house rules were like table rules. And they were just kind of the unspoken things that we knew in our house. And so we had two big rules. I have two older brothers. There's just three boys in the house. My poor mom. We broke everything and everything stunk all the time. But we had these two house rules. One of them was you had to wear a shirt at the table, which I get feels obvious, but it wasn't in our household. And the second one was no passing gas at the table. That was it. That was the only two rules. And if you broke either one of those rules, you had to leave the table. And so you would be amazed. It feels like low-hanging fruit. That's pretty simple. You'd be amazed how many times one or multiple of us had to leave the table for offending those two rules. Now, here was the thing. We'd always try to convince our dad. Of course, this is my brothers, not me, of course. But if someone passed gas and Dad would that's it, leave the table. He makes us go stand in the other room. We're like, Dad, it didn't go with us. We don't know how, this isn't solving the problem, but that's the way it went no matter what. And so there was also punishments in our house. So let me just say it this way. If we ever broke one of the rules, and these were just the table rules, there were other rules, and again, my parents weren't overlords, but most of them were again, pretty simple things that you would feel like were easy to kind of abide by, but you'd be surprised by, again, how many times we broke these simple rules. But if we ever broke the rule, let me just say, in our household, timeout was not a preferred methodology. My parents were like, oh, sure, we're going to let you go sit in your room and play Nintendo. That's not how it's going to happen. Now, so I actually would have preferred timeout, but my parents, and just feel whatever you're going to feel, and then we'll get on through, and I'll talk about how amazing my parents are. But there was physical punishment. There were spankings in our house. And some of you are like, oh, no. But and I get it, and we've had all different forms of, discipline with our kids. But I will say for me and my brothers, it sorted us out on many occasions, and we're doing pretty well right now, the three of us. But my mom, time to time, would just reach for the closest thing. And there were multiple occasions that I was spanked with a fly swatter. Doesn't hurt at all, right? But we didn't want her to know that, so we would scream and writhe in pain because we begged for it to be the fly swatter when the time came. So we didn't want to let her know that it just didn't harm us at all. But then there was this other thing. So I still to this day, I don't know what kind of vegetation this is, but there was a shrub outside of our house that to this day, I only know it as the switch tree. I don't know what it was, but it was evil. I tried to kill it, and it just had 9 lives. The thing wouldn't die. And so sometimes that was the form of punishment. And I remember this one time, my brother and I were just at each other, and my mom and she had it. She's like, I've got a new way to solve this. So she employed a new tactic. She said, you two, go out to the tree, and you're going to pick the switches for each other. That sounds like, you're like, oh, that's kind of novel. That's an interesting, like, that'll probably sort it out. So me and my brother went out, and there was like long negotiation. He's 5 years older and a lot smarter. Let me just say that. So we're negotiating, and so we're like, let's get really small switches. Like, you got one? Yeah, let me see it. You got one? Yeah, so we went inside and like hold it up, and they're like 2 inches long. Like, and then my brother, from out of his sleeve, starts to pull this switch. And have you ever seen one of those magician tricks where they just keep pulling the handkerchief or whatever? It like just keeps coming out. I'm like, dude, that is not what we agreed to. And in my mind, it was like 6 foot long, right? And then I've got this little one, and my mom's looking at the two of us, and she just burst into laughter, right? So that day, I'm pretty sure we got spanked with a fly swatter again, right? So this was the beginning. Like, and I don't know what it was. You had something in your child. My parents are great people, by the way. Don't email me later. I'm great. I haven't been in counseling for it. So if here's what I would tell you, though. You've got it. Like, in your past, in your childhood, as you move through the ranks of life, there were certain things that were introduced that were the beginning of behavior modification. That's what this was. I started learning early on to associate certain behaviors with certain outcomes. Like, if I do this, this thing's going to happen. I don't like this thing, so I'm not going to do that. I started to associate certain outcomes on the positive side too. If I do this, I like this outcome, so I'm going to do this thing. And most of you have some version of this in your childhood, in your teenage years, where you learned about behavior modification. Like, I knew what things to avoid. I knew what words to avoid. I knew which situations to avoid. I knew when to hold the words in. I knew when to hold all the things in at the table. You learn all of these things, right? And here's what happens. We drag that from our childhood to our adulthood, and there's an adult version of that. Like, we learn to modify our behavior. It's a part of a cultural thing. And there's an adult version of it, and we call it putting our best foot forward. That's the language. And you did this. Like, you went to a job interview, and you knew there were certain outfits you couldn't wear, certain things you couldn't say, because you had to put your best foot forward in order to get the job. Like, you modified your normal behavior in order to get a certain outcome. We do this in all different situations in life. Maybe you did this when you were like going to college. You modified your behavior. Like, if there was a physical interview, not just a paper interview to get into the college, like, you were on your best behavior, your best foot forward. Like, parents, if you've ever interviewed a babysitter, you literally threaten your kids with their life before the babysitter comes. Like, you better not ruin this for us. Like, you better be on your best behavior, because if that college girl really finds out how terrible you are, then we're not going to get a date night. And so that you leverage this thing, and you say, you got to put your best foot forward. And we've learned it. Again, all different situations in life, as adults, we've learned behavior modification. But here's the thing. When it comes to our souls, like what's inside of us, like our hearts, the innermost being, like where everything flows from it. When it comes to our souls, behavior modification isn't the best way. There's a better way. So last week, we kicked off this series called Living with Yourself. Like, I don't know if you know this, but the most difficult person to live with is yourself. Some of you are like, no, you haven't met the other people I live with. And they're saying, well, you haven't met the person I live with. The most difficult person to lead is yourself. And so we talked about this idea of 3 different habits, and this is what we're looking at in this series, 3 different habits that will safeguard your soul. And again, when we say soul, we're just talking about kind of the center, the inside, the parts of us that no one else sees, how to safeguard our souls. And so last week, I'll do a quick recap. We introduced this first habit. It was to surrender your will. Specifically, we talked about surrendering our will to God. And here's the thing, and I said this last week, I'll say it again today, like, this flies against human nature. Everything in us resists surrender. And I talked about, use this analogy of like riding a bicycle down a hill. You get to a max speed, but then there's everything in you tells you, I shouldn't take my feet off the pedals. But when you do, gravity kicks in and you reach a whole new capacity. This is the same thing. This is a picture of what happens when we surrender our wills to God. And I talked about this last week. I know it's counterintuitive, but we find ourselves when we surrender to God with a capacity that wasn't there before. When we surrender to God, it opens up a whole new way of seeing and interacting and living within the world. And we talked about this idea too. Talked about these public disasters when you've seen someone and like their story kind of hits the news, their story comes out at work, their story comes out at home, and you just can't believe the double life that they were living. And you ask yourself, whether you say it out loud or internally, like, how could this happen? Like, how could they live with themselves? How could they keep showing up to work or church or wherever, and this is their life? And the implication of that, or the thing that we're intuitively saying is, it could never happen to me. Like, and we said this last week, we have to start by realizing that we have the capacity in us for significant amounts of duplicity. And what's on the inside not matching what's on the outside. Or the way that we act with one person being different than the way that we act with another person. And we said that one of the ways to close the gap between the current version of me and perhaps a future version of me that will exist is by surrendering our wills to God. So to get us started today, as we kind of get ready for the second habit, I want to go back to a quote that I just think is a great framework for this. A pastor has said this. It says, "The health of your soul determines your capacity for duplicity." And what we mean by duplicity is what I just said. You're different with different people, right? It's ultimately some form of behavior modification. You're different on the inside than the outside. Like, you've learned to kind of like, there's a version of you that exists out there and a version of you that exists in here, and you don't want people out there to know what exists in here. He says, the health of your soul determines your capacity, my capacity for duplicity. A healthy soul has very little tolerance for duplicity. And so this series really is about, like, okay, if that's true, how do I have a healthy soul? So today, as we look at the second habit, I want to look at a story from the life of Jesus. And this story, Jesus and his crew, his closest followers, his disciples, as we know them, they're doing their thing, which they go around healing, they go around teaching. You read the Gospels, you see what they're doing. They're doing their thing, and the religious leaders of the day, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, they make their way over to Jesus, and they say, basically, Jesus, your followers aren't doing it right. Like, they're not following all the rules. They're like, Jesus, there's a way to do this thing, and your guys are not doing it right. Like, there's a way, there's a religious system that the elders have passed down, and they're not in line with the traditions of the elders. This is what they said. Now, when they said traditions of the elders, what they were referring to was something that we know of as the oral Torah. There was a written list of kind of guidelines and regulations in the Old Testament. But then in addition to that, there was what was known as the oral Torah. It was supposedly an oral law that, in addition to the law that God gave Moses, the Ten Commandments, the civil law, there was this oral law that had been passed down from generation to generation that was kind of the house rules. Like, if you go back to my analogy earlier, it's like, there wasn't a like plaque on the wall that had the two household or table rules. It's like, I don't know, maybe my older brother, like one day told my middle brothers, like, hey, let me just let you know, I've done these two things, don't do this. And then one day my middle brother told me it was passed down generation to generation. That was the idea of the oral Torah, is that over time it had been passed down generation to generation. Now, scholars debate on the validity of these oral traditions, but this is what was happening in this passage. And what ends up happening with the oral tradition is it breeds laws on top of laws. You end up having this just kind of mangled web of laws. You have laws that help you keep the laws, that help you keep the laws, and it moves from generation to generation. And what ends up happening is it becomes incredibly burdensome and difficult. I'll give you an example of this. One of the written laws said that people were not to do business or to work on the Sabbath. Like, this is a Jewish thing. In fact, some of you grew up in a household, if it was a religious household, where they said it about Sunday. It was actually true of Saturday. The Sabbath was Saturday. But they would say, hey, we don't work on Sunday. You may have had that rule in your house growing up. You didn't even know why. It comes from this. You're not supposed to work. You're not supposed to do business on the Sabbath. But then the Pharisees came in with the oral tradition, and they took it a step further. They introduced another law to enforce the original written law. They said, you know what? Here's the deal. If there's no money changing, if there's no exchange of money on the Sabbath, then you can't do work. So they put a law on top of the law in order to keep the law. And as you can imagine, over time, this system became more and more complex, and it became more and more burdensome. And these Pharisees, they became the monitors. They became the bus monitors. They became the HOA, like making sure everything in your household and your lawn was perfect. Laws upon laws upon laws. And they became the monitors of this oral tradition. And it became complex. And it became heavy and burdensome. I think it's one of the reasons that Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. comparing and contrasting. He's saying, hey, I know this system that has been brought down is unbearable. So as we enter the story that we're going to look at today, when the Pharisees are saying, hey, Jesus, your followers, your guys, they're not following the rules of the elders. They're talking about one specific oral tradition. Now, if you know much about Jewish culture, you know that there are a lot of Jewish dietary laws that are a part of the Old Testament. And so all of these dietary laws were written. Then the oral tradition comes in and takes it a step further. And they say, you know what? The whole reason for the dietary laws is so that nothing unclean comes into your body. So the oral tradition then came in and said, and this is what the Pharisees were supporting and propagating. They said, now we want to take it a step further and say, in order to make sure that you don't have anything unclean come into your body, we're going to have very specific rules of how you wash your hands. So ultimately, this whole thing we're about to read is because these religious leaders tell Jesus' followers, you're not washing your hands right. That's where it picks up. Now, I want to say this before we jump into the passage. Jesus was not a fan of the oral Torah. This whole idea, and you see it all throughout. If you've ever read, and I would encourage you to read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, it's the story, the interactions of Jesus. As you read these interactions, these bus monitors, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, Jesus was constantly having interactions with them that were like this. And the reason for that was this oral Torah and their holding up of it, because Jesus knew that it was all just a ploy to use guilt in order to control people's behaviors. It was all just a ploy to use to modify people's behaviors. And here's the thing, that was never God's intention. So as we pick up, Matthew chapter 15, 10 and 11, that's the context. Jesus calls the crowd to him and he says, and it's in response to them saying, hey, your disciples aren't washing their hands right. He says, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth doesn't defile them. So Jesus is like, let me just sort this out. I'm going to call everybody over. I'm not just going to talk to the religious leaders because they're talking to everybody. So we're going to talk to everybody at once. He says, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth doesn't defile them. Now again, in the first century, for us, this doesn't mean anything to us. But in the first century, this was a big deal because they thought what they ate could put them at odds with God. So now Jesus is coming in and saying, all right, I'm going to shed some new light on this. I'm going to explain this in a new way. He continues. He says, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles it. He said, hey, it's not what you eat. It's what comes out of your mouth that puts you at odds with God. It's not what goes in. It's what comes out. Now, this is not even subtle. Jesus is taking a jab at the religious leaders of the day and the lunacy of these laws upon laws upon laws that are designed to modify people's behavior. And then I love this. Matthew and Mark both, as they're kind of recording history, they record it the same way. They both tell us that Jesus essentially drops the mic and he just walks off. That's it. He just rolls a hand grenade in the room. He messes with the oral tradition, says, hey, all that stuff they've been teaching you, that is wrong. They've missed the heart of God. He doesn't explain himself, drops the microphone, and just walks away. And I don't know, but that makes me like Jesus just a little bit more. Like he just walks away. Now, here's what's interesting, and I think part that we need to understand of where Jesus is coming from. Jesus understood something that the religious leaders then, and I really think that oftentimes the religious leaders that are in positions like mine today don't understand. The law was not given in order to please God. The law was given in order to protect people. And when you get those two switched around, your religious system becomes just that. It becomes a religious system. When you miss that, here's what I think. This is so dangerous. You miss the heart of God. When a church or a religious system misses that, and that's what was happening. These guys were the religious leaders of the day, but they had taken something and they were literally missing the heart of God. The law wasn't given in order to please God, but in order to protect people. And when we get that switched around, it creates something that was never what God intended for it to be. Here's the thing. Rules and regulations and all of the things, and let me just say it this way, if I can say it this way. Are there rules in Christianity? Yes. But here's the question you have to ask. Why? Why are there rules? Why are there things that we're to do and not do? Why are there things that we're to engage in and disengage from? The question is why. It's not because there's an egotistical God out there that just wants to remind you all the time that he has the authority and you're in subjugation to him. That is not it. It's not about that. Instead, there's a different way to look at it. There is a heavenly Father that loves his children and says, that will hurt you, and I want to protect you. And so all of the things, all of the rules, all of the guidelines come within the context not of an egotistical God, not of someone that just wants to kill our fun, but of a God that says, hey, I love you as a father, and I know what's best for you. I can see if you keep doing that, it's going to hurt you. If you keep going there, if you keep allowing your mind to do that, it's going to take you to a place that allows you to become someone that I never desired that you would become, and it's going to hurt you, and it's going to hurt others. And so for that reason, there are rules to protect. My wife and I, Angie, we have 4 children. And I remember early on, we lived in this cul-de-sac for many, many years. And early on, we made some rules, some road rules. Like as they were riding their bikes, we had certain rules. And I can only imagine as a child, like, and you guys know this if you're parents, your kids don't understand the rules, right? Like when you make rules, like when we made these road rules, I'm sure from their vantage point, it looked like you're just trying to kill our fun. What do you mean we can't go on that street? What do you mean we have to wear a helmet? What do you mean we have to do all these things? It just feels like you're just killing all the fun, right? From the vantage point of a child. But from us as a parents, we were looking at this saying, no, we're trying to prolong your life. We'd actually like you to live. We'd actually like you to have an enjoyable life. This is the vantage point from which God sees us. It's a loving heavenly Father that says, hey, I want the best for you. And because of that, there's some rules. There's some things that are going to guide you in a direction that allow you to have the most satisfying life possible. So you got Jesus. He's interacting with these religious leaders. He's just rolled a hand grenade in the room to kind of like blow up their whole paradigm of thinking. And then he just walks off. So his followers say, hey, Jesus, we think you actually might have offended the religious leaders. To which I'm sure he's thinking, I know. And then they said, but also, Jesus, we have no idea what you were talking about. And so Jesus pulls back up. It's like he pulls up a chair, and this is what he says in Matthew chapter 15, verse 16 and 17. He says, are you still so dull? Jesus asked them. Now, if you're not familiar with Jesus, he's being funny. That's funny. Like, in fact, you should just try this at home. Try this with your parents. Try this with your boss. Try this with your spouse. The next time they're not understanding you, just pull up and say, hey, I just want to know, are you guys still so dull that you don't understand me? And see how it goes. This is what Jesus is doing. He's changing the mood. He says, are you still so dull? And then he goes on. He says, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes through the stomach and then out of the body? Like, just imagine saying this to a group of grown-ups. I'm sure they're thinking, yeah, we've seen that. We're familiar with the process, seen it today. What's your point? Jesus continues. What comes out of a person is what defiles him. In other words, he's saying again, what comes out of a person, it's not what goes into them. It's not these things that the religious leaders have told you. It's what comes out of a person that puts them at odds with God. Now, I can only imagine, like I'm trying to envision this scene happening. I can only imagine his followers looking at him thinking, okay, Jesus, you've got our attention. We don't understand the potty humor. We don't understand what's happening, but we're paying attention, and we really need you to finish the sentence because we don't know what's happening. And then I love this. Jesus continues, and I love how Mark, if we'll skip over to Mark, this is how Mark captures this in Mark chapter 7. Same story, same interaction from Mark's vantage point. He says, for it is from within, out of a person's heart, soul, same thing we've been talking about, the innermost part of us, it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. And at that point, I'm sure his followers are thinking, so you're saying that evil thoughts can put us at odds with God? And Jesus would say, yes, because all evil actions find their origin in evil thoughts. There is no evil action that has ever happened in this world, in your life, to you, by you, around you, that didn't start somewhere as a thought. And this is what Jesus is saying. They come as evil thoughts. And then he gives some examples. It's a daunting list. I'm going to warn you. He gives examples of things that are seen in the world. You can see them. But Jesus is saying, hey, these are actions. These are things that you can see. They're things that have happened to you, through you, by you. They're things you can see, but let me just tell you, they started inside. You see them outside, but they started inside, and here's the list. He says sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and bad judgment, which just means foolishness, like you've made foolish decisions. And this is so important. When these guys heard this list, that Jesus leveraged. Immediately their minds triggered. And they thought, Jesus, these are all things directed towards other people. These are all things that hurt other people. And Jesus, I thought we were talking about our relationship to God, not other people. To which I wonder if Jesus internally thought, and perhaps he said, I don't know, it's not recorded. I wonder if he thought exactly. That's exactly it. Because when you're at odds with them, whoever the them is in your life, when you hurt them, when you devalue them, when you ignore them, you are in fact devaluing me and hurting me. When you're at odds with them, you're at odds with me. How many of you in the room are parents? You got parents in the room? Parents, I want you to think about this. Kids, just trust me on this one. I've said this before. You cannot mistreat my kids and be okay with me. Like, if you're taking advantage of my kids, if you're hurting my kids, if you're doing something that takes opportunity off the table for my children, if you're stealing something from them, and that you want you and I to be okay, we're going to have a problem. Like, you can't be at odds with my kids and be all right with me. Why would we think, and I've said this so many times if you've heard me say it before, why would we think it'd be any different with God? You can't be at odds with his kids. We can't do things that hurt the other kids, the others in the family, and then feel like, oh, but I'm okay. I've been praying. I've been doing the thing. I'm all right here. But all of these other things are happening. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, bad judgment. They all hurt others. And Jesus is saying, guys, don't miss this. This isn't about here. This is about here. You can't be at odds with other people. Being okay with me. And then this is my summary statement of what Jesus is saying. Thoughts that become behaviors that hurt other people will put you at odds with God. This is what Jesus was saying, and this was revolutionary thinking. People would try to be okay with God while everything around them with other people was a disaster. And Jesus was saying, no, you're missing the point. That's religiosity. That's legalism. The thing is this, how you treat other people is how you are treating me. You can't be at odds with them and be okay with me. This is the heart of this new kingdom that Jesus came to introduce. He said, hey, in my kingdom, he talked about his kingdom all the time. There's a new way of doing things. There's a new way of treating people. There's a new way of loving people. There's a new way of extending grace. In my kingdom, everyone has value. In my kingdom, this is what happens. Eventually, our behavior, our heart will be reflected in our behavior. Whatever is in here eventually comes out and affects the people around us. And it reflects and identifies the condition of our heart. You ever heard the saying, hurt people hurt people? Like, you know it, right? Like, if you pull back and have enough self-awareness in your own life, sometimes the argument or frustration you have with the people in your life, it's not really about them, it's about what you experienced that day. It's about the struggle you have, the addiction you have, the thing that's going on in your life, the secret thing that you have in your world. It's the physical thing that you have going on. You're not feeling good, and all of a sudden there's a fight in your house, and it wasn't about what he said or she said. It was about you. Hurt people hurt people. And if we're self-aware, we know this. And if you're really self-aware, sometimes the evil or the hurtful things that people say towards you, if you can just categorize it really, it's just someone that's hurt. I heard my friend Patrick, who taught here a couple weeks ago, I heard him say this at some point. The idea that hurt people is saying what Jesus said, that eventually whatever is in you comes out of you. Whatever is in your heart and in your soul eventually makes its way out into the stratosphere, into the air. I heard my friend Patrick say this. He said, help people, help people. That's the other side. Yeah, hurt people, hurt people. But if you've been helped, if you've been rescued, if you've been redeemed, if those are your realities, then at some point that's going to make its way out as well. In other words, the condition inside eventually flows to the outside. This is what Jesus was teaching to his followers. If there's a storm inside, there's going to be a storm outside. The conditions inside eventually flow to the outside. And this is what Jesus is saying, so important. Behavior modification isn't enough. Because this thing isn't about what's happening outside. It's about what's happening on the inside. So I want to look at this list one more time. Immorality, adultery, theft, deceit, slander, adultery, envy. Look at all these. Theft, greed, bad judgment. As you look at that list, here's what I want you to consider. You don't have to say anything out loud. Just think about it. Do you know people that have been hurt by something on this list? Do you know people that their lives have been altered by something on this list? Do you know people that have been affected in the last week, month, or year by something on this list? Have you been affected by something on this list? The answer is yes. And in some cases, here's what's true. It caught you off guard because you're like, I didn't see it coming. Because I mean, they seem like they had their life put together, and then all of a sudden this thing goes public. The boss finds out, the teacher finds out, the spouse finds out. I didn't see it coming, and here's what happens. The reason is because there's a gap. We're trying to, over time, that person has learned to modify their behavior, but they haven't learned to monitor their soul, and there is a massive difference between those two. When you're asking the question, how did it happen? Usually it's because someone got into a mode, like the religious leaders of Jesus' day, modifying behavior rather than paying attention to the realities on the inside. These are all things that start on the inside and then eventually manifest themselves on the outside. And I'm just telling you, and this is what Jesus was saying, behavior modification won't fix it. Which leads us to habit number 2 to guard your soul. It's simply to monitor your heart. It's not about behavior modification. There are times where we need to pay attention to what we're doing, but really we need to pay attention to ask, why did I do that? Where's that thing coming from? What is the thing inside? What's the thing underneath it? Not just the action, but like, what is in my heart? What's in my soul? What's in me that caused me to move in that direction, that caused me to react in that way? And so I want to give you 4 suggestions as we wrap up today. They're not original to me. In fact, I'm going to tell you about the book that I got these from. I read this book many years ago under a different title, under a new title that I just was absolutely life-changing for me. But anyway, it comes from that book. But there are 4 enemies of our heart that can just corrupt our soul, what's inside of us. And if these 4 enemies, just these 4, and there may be more, but if these 4 enemies, if we can learn to kind of counteract, to push against these, it'll change the quality of our life. These 4 enemies will literally rot our souls. So the first one is simply this. It's guilt. Some of you live in such guilt. Some of us live in such guilt. Guilt simply says, I owe you. Like guilt is this thing that says, I owe someone. I owe them an apology. I owe, like you're carrying a secret. And you know you owe them honesty, and guilt will rot your soul. You know that you owe them you need to say something out loud to them. There's something that you've done, there's something that you've said, and you know it. You know it's hurt someone, and you know that you owe them. Guilt says, I owe you. The antidote to guilt is to confess. It's not fun, it's not easy, but it will liberate your soul. It starts to free us. This idea that we just take a deep breath and engage and confess, and it starts to remove guilt. The second enemy of our hearts or our souls is anger. Anger says, you owe me. Like, you ever felt like you're just not getting your way? You're not getting what you deserve. Somebody else got ahead in the job. You lost your job. You lost your marriage. You lost the opportunity. They got into the school. You didn't. You got kicked out. They did the same thing, and they stayed. Like, and anger says, you know what? They owe me an explanation. They stole some time from me. For some of you, someone stole portions of your childhood. Maybe something happened, stole your first marriage, literally stole your business idea, stole your career. Something happened, and I'm not diminishing this. It's real. Like, it really happened. And here's the thing. The person on the other side that perpetrated that harm to you, they can't give you back the time. They can't even give you back the opportunity. There's nothing they can say or do. Here's the thing. When you have anger, the antidote to anger is to forgive. But here's the thing that's so hard, because doesn't it feel like to forgive them is to let them off the hook? But here's what Jesus would say. Now, when you forgive them, I know it feels like that way, child. But when you forgive them, it releases you. It frees you. The third thing that will just rot our soul is greed. Greed says, I owe me. Greed forces people to compete with our stuff, with our performance, with our next job raise, with our next nice car, with our next thing, whatever it is. It forces people to compete with our stuff. And here's what greed does. Greed excuses us from being generous because you say, I owe me. Like the world owes me. People owe me. Like I deserve this. This is what belongs to me. Because this is the thing that's underneath greed. Underneath greed is this assumption that everything that I can see is meant for me to be able to consume it. And the antidote, it's not very difficult to think about for greed, is to give. Give often. Give with a plan. Be generous to other people. We should raise the water level for people around us. If we're successful, the people around us that know us should be better off as a result. It safeguards our soul when we're generous. And the last one, the last thing that's an enemy of our heart that'll just rot our souls is jealousy. Jealousy is this like subtle, ugly thing where like even if you don't say it out loud, you just can't celebrate the successes of another person or another organization or when she moved on or when he moved on and they got a better life or it actually worked out for them. There's this thing in us that just kind of wants to celebrate when they don't succeed or they don't fail. It's this thing that says life owes me. Life owes me something. And ultimately, if we think life owes us something, eventually we'll project it and we'll think God owes me something because God could have done something about it and he didn't. God blessed them, but not me. God allowed them to be born in that zip code, have that opportunity, get that job, but not me. God gave them those physical talents, those intellectual abilities, but not me. And ultimately, what ends up happening is it just corrupts our soul. And the antidote to jealousy is to celebrate. To celebrate openly and often. To celebrate what others have and to celebrate what God has done, both in your life and the life of others. I think this is one of the reasons that corporate worship is so important. Sometimes, has it ever been true, and you don't have to say it out loud, but you're seeing one of the lines to one of those songs, and you're like, I'm struggling to believe that right now. I'm struggling to say that. Celebration, sometimes the worship is a sacrifice. You're bringing a sacrifice. You're saying, I'm going to celebrate you, God, even though. I'm going to celebrate you, God, even though. Celebrating the other people in our life, celebrating God in our life. And here's what here's what the Proverbs, Solomon says. Same idea as Jesus. He said this in Proverbs, that our hearts, our souls, they're the wellspring of life. So you got to guard with everything that's in you. You've got to guard your heart. He's saying the same thing as Jesus because what's in here eventually comes out there. And when what's in here hurts the people out there, then you are going to be out of sorts with God because you can't be out of sorts with God's people and God's kids and be all right with God. So I just want to say again, this is not behavior modification. This is monitoring our souls to ask ourselves, when I acted that way, why? What was going on inside of me that drove me to that place? And then early and often, adopt these things and let them become habits in your life to confess, to forgive, to give, and to celebrate over and over again. Confess, forgive, give, and celebrate. And these things will begin to safeguard your heart. So let me pray for us. Father, this is not difficult stuff to understand, but Father, it's so difficult to do. So I pray that today you would give us the ability to be honest with ourselves, where an outward action has found its origin in something that's inside of us. God, maybe we've never even thought about it that way, that our anger is really something on the inside that's now coming out on the outside, that God, our greed is really something on the inside that's coming out on the outside. So I pray that this morning you just give us the grace to be honest about who we are. I pray that you would be gentle with us as a father. But then, God, I pray you give us the courage to take the steps to monitor our souls, to make sure that we have healthy souls, so that what Solomon said, we guard our hearts so that the wellspring of life, what flows from us, is beautiful and good for those around us. Father, we love you. Thank you for how relevant your word is. Jesus, thank you for how relevant your teaching all those years ago was and is for us right here and right now. We love you. In Jesus' precious and powerful name we pray, the resurrected name of Jesus. Amen and amen. So I want to give you a